So this event will explore the themes and the issue of migration, migration and diaspora, and how cinema, well, especially the video essay, I'm big on video essays, so I think they have an important role to play in allowing us to travel, if not migrate, through space and time, if not physically, at least visually and mentally, as social and visual journeys in the process of negotiating distances, distances provoked by political conflicts, by colonialism, by violence, by the forces that divide us. So how does cinema respond to separation through extraction, through violence, and how do artists and activists use cinema and other digital technologies as ways of questioning these forces of violence and colonial conflict that separate us? So I first call to the stage Suneil Sanzgiri, artist, researcher, filmmaker, whose work has been screened extensively at festivals and venues around the world, including International Film Festival Rotterdam, New York Film Festival, Hong Kong International Film Festival. He just premiered his first institutional solo exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum last fall. And he is currently working on his first feature-length work focusing on bonds of solidarity that developed out of the resistance to the Portuguese Empire between India and Africa. Welcome, Suneil. And joining Suneil is Greg de Cuir Jr., the co-founder and artistic director of Kino Pravda Institute in Belgrade. Greg has organized and curated programs around the world, but I just want to single out one particular retrospective that took place here in Locarno in 2019, Black Light, a groundbreaking retrospective about Black film talent and really brought a completely new point of view to Locarno Film Festival. Greg is also the editor of the Nexus Journal for Cinema and Media Studies, which is a publishing partner of this conference. And I also want to just shout out, I think it was at the Black Star Festival, that we were talking about Black futurism through digital technologies, and your way of presenting this was a music video by Tribe Called Quest, this amazing music video called The Scenario, where the members of Tribe Called Quest are kind of situated in these like digital interfaces, and this was like 1991 or 92, and so it's like one of the very first desktop films. And it made me realize that hip-hop itself is this kind of futuristic technology where the mind is just moving at the speed of thought, projecting itself into the future. So hip-hop is like OG Black futurism, and Greg, I really appreciate that you put this in front of us, so welcome. And last but not least, Devika Girish. Devika is the editor of Film Comment magazine and a talks programmer at New York Film Festival, and producer and co-host of my favorite film podcast, the Film Comment Podcast. Subscribe to it immediately. And Devika's work as a writer and curator explores the entanglements of moving image culture with race, labor, colonialism, and power. Devika, where are you? All right, so microphones, here you go. Take it away.
Right. Thank you so much, Kevin. This is my third year participating in the Basecamp Cinema Futures activities organized by Kevin, and it's consistently been a highlight of my time at Locarno. As I was saying to Libby right before, I'm so grateful to have this space in the midst of the fantasy world of the festival to talk about very real things. And so that's what we're going to do today. So glad to have my friend Suneil and Greg here, who I couldn't ask for better interlocutors. And thank you, Kevin, for shouting out the Film Comment podcast. I just want to say that this conversation will go on the podcast next week. So if you have people who really wanted to be here but couldn't, share that information with them. So let's start. And Suneil and I were talking a little bit on our way here about where to begin with this question. The question being, how does digital media allow us to confront legacies of colonial extraction? It's a big question. And actually, as we were walking up, the thing that we got stuck on and sort of started arguing about is, what is digital media? I mean, what is that term? And we thought that it would be good to start this conversation by maybe, Suneil, you talking about what are the mediums, the media that you use in your filmmaking practice, and why? What are the choices that lead you to using the tools that you use in your practice? And let's go from there.
Yeah, so my work employs like a lot of different variety of media, from 16 millimeter and hand processing, hand developing, direct animation. I use a lot of archival material, sort of pre-existing material, work that I like to sort of, images that from the past that I like to commune with and generally find a way to alter or engage with in different ways. But I also use a lot of digital, quote-unquote, digital imagery, everything from desktop aesthetics to drone footage, LiDAR scanning, photogrammetry, 3D renderings, and oftentimes I'll confuse the two by filming those digital animations, the 3D renderings, the desktop aesthetics, back onto 16. And so there's an intentional kind of slippage between the analog and the digital that I find to be really productive in different ways, and we can get into that a little bit. But yeah, so I mean, there is a tension between the analog and the digital, both in ways that I think we experience it on a daily basis, where there's an intentional confusion where you might think, like when watching one of my films, that you accidentally clicked out of the film and you're just on your desktop, right? It's a very literal kind of replication of the desktop. Other times you'll see the desktop appear on like 16 millimeter and you see the sprockets. And then I'll use like, things like news tickers and things like that. So there's like an intentional slippage between the familiar and something that is a bit more, it really should not be there in some sense.
So I do want to get into some of these aesthetic choices and implications that the different media have, but I'm also curious what, especially in your early days as a filmmaker, influenced your choice of medium. Was it this vision of wanting to play with mediums and the different affects they produce? Or was it based on access to? I mean, was it based on what you had access to as a young filmmaker working in this cinema space?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first film in this trilogy of works, which is called Barobar Jagtana, which is a Konkani phrase that loosely translates to continuously surviving, continuously living or continuously surviving. And the first film is called At Home But Not at Home, which is a quote from this interview with Stuart Hall, the cultural theorist Stuart Hall. And the film really was, I realized I had very little like quote-unquote assets, right? Like there were no, I was started to make a film about this sort of desire of wanting to connect to my ancestral homeland of Goa, where my family lives, where my ancestors came from, but a place I had never been. I had not, gotten a chance to go. So a lot of it is sort of, the film begins with like these email exchanges with a videographer that I commissioned to film parts of Goa, parts of the landscape, the train stations and things. And then I started interviewing my father about his memories of growing up under Portuguese colonialism. And they were very kind of innocuous questions, very banal questions about like, what was your first time at the cinema? Which led into so many questions about like, just the kind of like implications of these sort of like, sometimes scarcity of resources, but also time, like this expanded sense of time. So that was, I had no material, right? I had my laptop, I had this, interview with my father that I recorded on not Zoom, but Skype. And also, I had been really interested in like the parallel cinema movement. So a lot of it was looking at other images, right? Images from other spaces. For instance, this Guru Dutt film Baz. And Guru Dutt, for those who don't know, an incredible filmmaker who made most of his films in Hindi, but he actually is Goan, or his family is Goan. And so he's like a Konkan filmmaker. So he has this film called Baz, which like had this image of a burning Portuguese slave ship. And that to me was like one of these images of like, the kind of like local, insurgent, anti-colonial efforts, and the film takes place in like the 1800s, which also like explored this idea that I had been, not an idea, but just this knowledge that like anywhere colonialism has existed in the world, there has always been a resistance to it from day one, right? But this film, like made in the 50s, really exemplified that. So I kind of, I do a lot of sampling, a sort of citational practice of sampling other works that are in the lineage or in the continuum of conversation that I'm interested in. Just one more thing about like the photogrammetry and the LiDAR scanning. That is a technology that, when we get into conversations about extraction, is this very like literally extractive technology, a technology that's used to mine like iron ore in Goa, like where my ancestral house is. There's like it's been devastated by the mining industry, and so the third film in the trilogy utilizes this very colonial technology of satellite mapping and LiDAR scanning, laser scanning. But we used it to map my ancestral house, which is where my father grew up and where like 30 of our family members would like sleep. And it's this really beautiful old Portuguese home and Portuguese style home. And so we mapped that using this same technology. So it's like this kind of question of like, is it possible to kind of utilize these technologies instead of exploitation, extraction, but for preservation is kind of the idea.
So the array of techniques that you've just mentioned, what do you consider new media and old media? Like, how do you distinguish these techniques as new and old? And like, what are the qualities that are the discerning lines for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about it in new media is a lot about distribution and dissemination, because we understand that like radio and television and cinema and film were one particular mode of dissemination and distribution. But we are in a new era of distribution and dissemination. The fact that I can pirate films that I want to sample and download them, and I use that as a citational practice. The fact that I can just, find so many images that resonate with me and then redistribute them, find a different way to engage with them and redistribute them. The fact that my work is pirated, the fact that like my films are on Karagarga, or how do you pronounce the pirate website, the fact that they're on Solidarity Cinema, and I love that. I'm like, if you really want my work, please seek it out. You can steal it. I'm fine with that. I mean, I would like to get paid, but if someone's going to steal it already, like, let me see your stuff too. Anyway, so like there's this whole, distributive model that I think isn't, that is how I look at digital media, is about the question of distribution.
So it's not something that's part of the mode of production for you?
Not necessarily, but I think it's at the same time knowing that distribution is always a part of, it is a part of the production. It's like you kind of know in the end goal, like if you're putting your thing up on Vimeo, that's different than like getting it distributed by Canyon Cinema or Lux or whatever else.
So Greg, maybe at this point I'd like to bring you in and talk a little more about the distinction between old and new media in your curatorial and research practice, which Kevin was alluding to. You are excavating oftentimes histories of African and Asian cinema, primarily a lot of African and Black cinema. And this is sort of often said of African cinema that the filmmaking resources in Africa were so tightly controlled by the colonial entities, in the first half of the 20th century, that in some parts of Africa, there's very little in terms of filmmaking history or archives that's like homegrown, in that part of history. And often digital media, new media, whatever you want to call it, is related to this flourishing of filmmaking practice in those sorts of parts of the world that, you know, were attained independence later, and also these frameworks gave filmmakers and artists in those parts of the world access to less capital-intensive resources. And I'm sort of curious about how you in your work, given this context, I mean, I'd like you to also interrogate this context if you don't agree with it, because, you know, sometimes the telling of history is very weighted in these contexts as well. But also, you know, how do you differentiate between old and new media? And what do you think those definitions, in what ways do they limit maybe our understanding of film history?
Thank you. Those are big questions. Old and new media. Well, first of all, I feel that everything old is new again. It's interesting when you talk about sampling, which is a language that I also feel very comfortable with. We can think about digital media as enabling sort of new sampling practices, but obviously sampling in and of itself as an act is nothing new. I think there are some inherent subversive qualities to sampling, and that's why I'm kind of drawn to that language, but that's my natural cultural language anyway. It's, yeah, and we have to, just coming back to your question, we obviously, you mentioned it, but we have to talk about sort of the colonial roots of cinema, or the colonial residue that's been sort of attached to the cinema camera from the beginning, so to speak, I guess, and to the industry and even in some cases the art of cinema. There's a question that I actually wanted to ask you, but I'll come back to that on this idea of what's old and new, because one of the things that I appreciate your work is this fluidity, or this fluency with technologies, whether it be analog, whether it be digital formats, whether it be photogrammetry and all these things. I don't know, it's hard for me to answer the question from my perspective and my research, because I try not to differentiate too much between what's old media, so-called, and what's new media, so-called. I mean, when I'm putting together programs, I follow the artists and I follow the work. When I'm putting together programs, I might, as Kevin mentioned, just as easily put in a music video from the 1990s that looks to the future as I would put in a 60mm film from the 21st century that looks to the past. And I like to sort of mix and match all those things together. And when it comes to research, it sort of depends on the artist. It depends on the context of what I'm looking at. And I just try to follow that and let that lead the way toward what's considered new or what's not new, or old or what's not old. So I don't know. Yeah, it's a difficult question.
Maybe I can make the question a little more specific,
Yeah.
which is that I guess I'm wondering if the premise of this talk, like how can digital media allow us to confront legacies of colonial extraction? Yeah. It presupposes that there is something specific about digital media and its relation to colonial extraction that's like different from, say, analog media's relation to colonial extraction. And I guess that's what I'm getting at. Like, do both these forms of filmmaking have different relations to colonial extraction? Does one allow us to confront this legacy better than the other? Or is that kind of the wrong door to be knocking on?
It's not the wrong door to be knocking on. I think just coming back to this idea of accessibility and open source and all these tools that are now more readily available, I think that offers more entryways, more entry points for a counter-cinema practice, or sort of a counter-colonial artistic practice. So whether we talk about in the Global South or the Global North, I think tools and sort of being able to get artists' hands on more tools just opens up more doors toward potential forms of critique. And going back to the original essence of your question, I guess, about Africa or other places that maybe sort of suffered under the yoke of colonialism a lot more, and including India, where those tools weren't available. Yeah, I want to believe that's somehow a breath of fresh air to have more sort of readily available. But things are not distributed evenly. We can't speak in sort of utopic terms, obviously, in terms of everyone has a phone, so everybody can use a phone and capture something. Well, where do the phones come from? What's the cost of mining the materials to make these phones?
Right.
So the terms of critique, the colonial practices, the extractive practices, maybe a little bit different, but the same in essence. I think with new technologies comes new methods of control and surveillance and extraction, but I hope also with those new times and new methods and new media come new artists that sort of have that media literacy and have those tools at their disposal to sort of continue to sort of try to outflank and outthink these colonial actions. So yeah, I'm optimistic in that sense. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of things. We're struggling on a lot of fronts, certainly in relation to capital and technology and corporations, but...
And genocide.
Yeah, there's enough problems in the world that, take our pick in terms of what we want and need and should counter. But yeah, the tools are out there, and I think they're readily accessible, and it's always a question of the tool and what will we do with it? What's your responsibility, my responsibility, yours, all of our sort of shared responsibility? What are we going to do with these tools?
I would like to kind of turn the same question to you, Suneil. I mean, do you think that one or other form or category of media is more, lends itself better to this confrontation with colonial legacy? Or, do you think that there is a value in approaching the question this way?
I don't know, it's difficult. It's a very tangled question, right? Because I don't think we can put qualifiers on certain ways. I mean, I think if we look at the sort of anti-colonial film output that was made during actual anti-colonial revolutionary moments of fomenting insurrection, right? Like, in the 60s, 70s, just to take the Portuguese colonies in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, like the amount of film output there was astonishing. At one point, Jean-Luc Godard just took a bunch of, just got as much money as he could from the French government and tried to, give it to, I'm pretty sure it was Angola, and just tried to, get as many cameras to people as he could. And he's like, that will help the revolution, is just to get as many cameras into the hands of the people as possible so they can document their own revolution. And of course, it didn't do anything, really. I don't know what they did.
What is anything?
What is anything, yeah. But, he kind of was like, his whole project kind of fell apart. And I think he had obviously preconceived colonial notions of what that might look like. But at the same time, I'm just, once again, just putting giving more access, just, to a population, to a people, without the necessary kind of critical development. This is what's interesting about places like Guinea-Bissau and Angola and other places, is that in these anti-colonial revolutionary efforts, education was at the front, and it was poetry. Poetry was a huge part of the educational initiatives, revolutionary poetry. And so, I'm just thinking about the way in which the poetics were a necessity of the educational praxis, revolutionary praxis for young school children. Poetry was part of the curriculum, right? And this is in the mangroves, the kind of secret places where the Portuguese weren't bombing. So, and also likewise in India and Goa, we didn't have a lot of film production. There was not a lot of cameras. So poetry was the kind of device through which, so anyway, going back to cameras or technology, I don't know that just more access, more cameras, more phones, more computers, etc., necessarily inherently is going to produce the kind of outcomes of a sort of counter-colonial or critical practice.
Sorry,
can I jump in?
Yeah,
I wanted to come back to the question that I wanted to ask you. In terms of technology and colonial, so we talked about the camera and how to sort of counter that, or sort of subversive practices, all these things. What I've often been wondering lately, and I have some colleagues that I've sort of collabed with on a project thinking about this, but how would we begin to conceptualize or to gesture toward or even fantasize about a decolonial technology? How would we, instead of trying to do something better with the tools that are laden with this residue, how would we develop new tools? This is a big question. I don't expect you to answer everything, but how can we think about developing actually new tools that maybe come from a space of decolonial thinking?
Yeah.
Well, it's not really a response, but I want to point back to something Suneil said earlier, when I was asking about what makes old media old, new media new, and you actually placed the emphasis on distribution. And so I want to kind of add that as a layer to your question, like, is there something as decolonial and colonial technology? I mean, is that the right adjective for technology? Or, this is an open question. It's like, is technology what you make of it? But also is what makes it colonial or decolonial is the circuit of production and distribution it's part of. So, even when we talk about extraction, something that often comes to my mind is how colonial markets, like colonial capitalism worked, which is raw material drawn from the colonies, the industry being based in the metropole, and being sold back to the colonies, right? So when I go to festivals and I see amazing films from the Global South, and then you see Hubert Ball's Fund and Sundance Lab, I mean, all the funding bodies are Western, which is just like, I've talked to Indian filmmakers who are like, this is the only way we can get funding to reach a certain level of professional expertise to get into certain markets. But sometimes I feel like that evokes that circuit, the films, it's hot to make films about Black and brown people in the Global South, but those films are not necessarily being funded, and neither are they going through those post-production houses are often like based in Europe, right? So festivals, exactly, those films aren't necessarily showing in festivals or being, theatrically shown in the places where they were made. So I guess when you said, like, what would it take to make a decolonial technology, I'm just wondering, or is the answer, like, what would it take to develop a circuit of production distribution that veers away from those old circuits?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And then I also just want to add about the way in which we're phrasing this, right? Like a colonial or decolonial technology is almost like a techno-determinist argument, right? Which is saying that, like, technology is the thing that is inherently doing the colonialism, or technology is doing the decolonizing, rather the society which produces the technology in the first place. So, a friend over here and I were talking, I don't know who I should be shouting out or if we're not, but we were talking earlier about the symposium that we're at about AI and all these things, and earlier there was a panel about the possibilities of can AI be used essentially for essentially like better programming of what AI is not doing itself. Like, can AI program AI to be better, but in service of humanity, like essentially in service of logically structuring our very illogical society, right? But the idea is that, like, our society is not set up for that in the first place. So why would we even expect technology to care about humans and the survival of humans if humans don't even care about humans or the survival of humans in the first place? So I think that it's like that technological determined argument is inherently in order for there to be a decolonial technology, we have to have a decolonized society, right? Like, there's no way in which the technology is going to precipitate the decolonizing of the most violent, evil, imperialist, so yeah, I'm just thinking about the ways in which we even categorize these things, right?
So I would like to come back to this, but not now. But I will put this in your heads so that you can have this in the back of your head as we talk, which is I would like us to end with a vision of what a decolonial filmmaking, curating, exhibiting practice looks like. Because I think we should do some world building, and it can be utopic, but I think we need to actively think of new models. But we'll come back to that so that we can think about that and I will also invite the audience to jump in at that point. So I'd love for us to exchange ideas about what a decolonial film world would look like. But Sunil, I'd like for us to watch a clip
yeah.
from one of your films because I want to talk about aesthetics.
Sure.
So let's
Yeah, so
hear
maybe
that.
we'll start with Golden Jubilee. It's the third film in the trilogy and has the most like sexy digital imagery of the works.
Actually, and that is something we'll talk about, sexiness. And
so-
it's important in
Yeah,
decolonial
I mean
practice.
it's lush, you know. It's very like it draws the viewer in intentionally because I'm like, you know, trying to get people to pay attention to some of the stuff that we're trying to talk about, right? I don't know why I was doing this.
Because we are near Italy.
We're in Italy. Okay, so this is from the film Golden Jubilee, and yeah, you know, this is 5 minutes into a 20-minute long film, so largely the context might be lost, but just go with it, right? All right, so I'm going to start the, yeah, ready? Okay.
To conquer the territory because the territory is part of India. We're not there to dominate foreign people because the people are our own kith and kin. We have gone there only to help them to liberate themselves.
But India has always been telling other countries, who told us at Suez, not to use force to settle disputes. Why are you now using force?
Violence is bad, but slavery is worse. I'm sure the British people would understand and appreciate that sentiment.
Gatice jana kamkar shetani shankar jana janglachi dal supa kanka pungurka. Al kanka solu garameren mal nakota. Majen khan kanka. Yeah, so there are all kinds of memories, social, political, family. So it had been a tradition for thousands of years. That's how people narrated their memories orally, but telling that to their children, to their grandchildren, and then children, grandchildren, and told their memories to their children and grandchildren, and that's the way through civilization we have try to remember. They're very important. They tell the next generation the value of the sacrifices and the traditions that they have for hundreds of years, and tell the next generation to keep those traditions. And just to keep those traditions is what motivates people to fight against any suppression, colonialism, conversions, and all those things. And so,
हांव सुनील संझगिरी ह्या काळाक जे तुमी आतां पळयतात ताचो मालक. आमी ह्या गांवांत सादारण 100 वर्सां पयलीं आयिल्ली संझगिरी मंडळ. संझगिरी मंडळ ही मूळ कुठ्ठाळी ह्या गांवची. पूण पुर्तुगेजाच्या कारणाक लागून तांगेले जे हिंदू धर्माक वगळटा तेन्ना आमची फॅमिली थंयच्यान भायर सरली आनी ती मागीर मंगेशी आयली. आमचो कुलदेव मंगेश. हे शहर म्हणजे चड करून मायनींग हब. हांगा मायनींग एक्टिविटी खूब चलता आनी जितले मायनींग काडूंक परवानगी आसा कायदेशीर ताचे परस चड मायनिंग जालें खूब कमी जाता म्हणजे मोठमोठे प्रोजेक्ट येतात मोठमोठे हे येतात ताका लागून ही ग्रीनरी कमी जावन गोंयची जे पूण ह्या दृश्टीन गोंयची जी आयडेंटिटी आसा ती वता काय कितें अशें आमकां दिसता.
Before we talk about this clip at all, I'd like to do a quick exercise. Do we have a mic for the audience that can be handed out? Yes. Okay, good. So maybe just, I'd like 3 people in the audience, just raise your hands to respond with just like one word describing the sensory effect of this clip on you. Like if you could use one word to describe the feeling that this clip from Golden Jubilee aroused in you. So just raise your hands and the mic will come to you.
Garbage. Be shy.
Don't be shy, please. Don't make this fall flat. Help me out.
There are only wrong answers.
Thank you. Over there.
I'd say pensive.
Great. Let's get 2 more. Over here.
I'd say like expansive. It felt like widening.
Lovely. 1 more.
Intense.
Great. Okay, so we have pensive, expansive, intense. And the reason I wanted to do this exercise before you talk about it is because, Greg, you mentioned the way Suneil goes between analog and these very digital images and mediums very fluidly. For me, the experience of watching Suneil's work in those specific moments when the lines blur, which we see here, physical house becoming a digital house, you know, is that it produces very strong feelings. It produces very strong emotional reactions. A little bit of that is like uncanny valley, elusiveness, but it's like expansive. It produces a feeling of melancholy, of intensity, of pensiveness. And I want to talk about that, the ways in which digital media and playing with these 2 forms brings us closer to things that don't exist. That's something your work does, right? It brings us closer to worlds that don't exist in reality. And the affect that that produces, whether that's like, melancholy or desire, or there's something when you encounter a visualization of a thing that's close to what you know, but doesn't conform to the laws of physics around you. I don't know if Suneil or Greg, if you want to maybe, okay, yeah.
I mean, you kind of really, pointed to a lot of what I think about when I think about.
I know you too well.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, and we've had this conversation before about this kind of possibility latent within animation. I mean, animation, the Latin root, to animate, right? This kind of poiesis, this life-giving. So animation is about bringing to life. And so, there's, I think when I think about that and I think about the possibilities that animation produces, it's about engendering things that can't, don't necessarily exist or cannot necessarily exist in our world. So like in the first film in the trilogy of works, this film At Home But Not at Home, the last scene is of an animated train, like a 3D rendered train going on these tracks in the kind of desert, in like the desert of India, and then you see this image of my father when he was about my age, and at first it just looks like a regular photograph, but then it starts to warp and you realize it's like a piece of fabric. And then you realize there's a train going by, and then you realize the scale of the image, and it drapes over the train, and the train starts to drag it along the train tracks. That is just something that, like, once again existed in my brain. I was like, I wonder what that would look like, I mean, I guess it could exist in this world if I had the budget to just like, rent a train and drape a gigantic photo of my father, which is like, yeah, there's a lot of layers to that. Someone can unpack that for me later in therapy. But, I just think that like, animation gives us these possibilities that are not defined by this world and are not defined by the limits and the constraints and the, oppression and all of the pressures that exist on this world. We have an opportunity. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that everything is just like carte blanche, right? Like there's not like a kind of a white slate, right? Like it's there's always when we attempt to think of new worlds, we often hit limits of our own imagination because our own imaginations are conditioned, right, by all of the structures that we are, surrounded by and the context in which we grew up, the environments in which we grew up. So our imaginations are colonized, our imaginations are gentrified, our imaginations are whatever else, and so it's necessary to exercise that muscle. And I think that like 3D rendering and animation, direct animation, etc., whatever it is, these are tools that we have the opportunity to attempt to visualize something else.
Yeah. And Greg, I would love it if in your response you also drew upon your work with Black Futurism, which also uses, digital technology and rendering in similar, like liberatory ways.
Yeah, I want to come back to this idea of animation, because this is actually what we were talking about yesterday. I think you were here yesterday for the discussion in terms of what can AI do for us, right? Or what can AI do for artists? It can let us sort of imagine worlds that we wouldn't have the budget to create. It can let us do this and that. We spoke about that yesterday very much from the perspective of larger budget, longer length narrative cinema. We didn't talk about it enough from the perspective of artists sort of doing artistic work, maybe sort of in non-commercial modes, maybe in more experimental modes. And we didn't, so I think this is a wonderful example of whether we're talking about animation or AI, sort of this world building project and what can be achieved. And I don't think we talk enough about in this slippage between, and not to sidetrack the conversation to become about AI, I mean, we're talking about technology, it's here. We got to go there a little bit.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that when we talk about AI and we sort of schematize it and what it can do and what it can't do for us, we don't talk enough about animation, actually. Yeah. We talk about this perfection of AI, and I can create this shot, and the camera can spin this way, and I can build this world. Well, you can fucking do that with animation, right? I mean, you can animate something and do that. We don't need AI to animate for us, but of course AI is going to animate for us, and that's also going to put people out of jobs. So we don't talk enough about that link between animation and AI, but I also appreciate the way that you use direct animation and these technologies for this sort of world building project. And I wanted to put that out there. And yeah, in terms of, I don't know, thinking of Black Futurism, I mean, these projects and these ways of working and these strategies are very much in sort of common and related in terms of the struggle and what they're struggling for and what they're struggling against. So I don't see so much of a difference. I mean, it's a big question, and I'm just thinking about futurism and trying to sort of extrapolate that with these digital tools and the way that we're talking about them. Yeah, I mean, it's the same struggle. That's the point. We have to sort of see the links and see the commonalities between these struggles and the tools and sort of what we're pushing for. So I'm not answering your questions very well on futurism and Black Futurism and all this, but I'll get there. But somehow I'm resisting it somehow. I don't know why.
No, I think you did. You answered it perfectly. I mean, this world building aspect is so crucial to it. Another way in which the effect of these digital modulations is that it actually gives like some kind of form to the existence, like a diasporic existence, which is obviously central to your work, in both like very concrete and abstract ways. In concrete ways, you had never been to Goa and you couldn't go there, and so you had someone shoot footage, and then you melted it, right? So in like these real ways in which you are separated from the place that your father is from. And then in these abstract ways, I mean, you have Zoom conversations with your dad, featured in one of the films, but in a very sort of, you weave it into the visual language of the film. And what the films also do is give some sort of real, like, thick form to the existence, like the existence in diaspora, which is also increasingly the condition of the world, both due to violent displacement and due to increased, like, the ability to travel, the ability to move around, which some people have that luxury, upon others it's enforced. So I'm also interested in talking about that, like how these stylistic choices really kind of try to touch that feeling of being, to quote the title of one of your films, at home but not at home.
I mean, I think that this is actually a question also about like the essay film in general, right? And like, I think so much of the essay film and its history has been pioneered by exilic filmmakers who are forced to live in exile and who are forced to find new ways to navigate, especially under political repression in Iran, in so many other places, I mean, increasingly in India, right? Where you're not able to speak to the thing that you want to speak to, right? Like you can't confront power directly. And so
you may cite, maybe, or...
Well, yeah, I mean, so Trinity Minha calls it speaking nearby, right? So it's like all of these ways in which the sort of societal conditions of diasporic filmmakers create and necessitate the invention of, I mean, maybe it's not invention, but necessitate this creative fugitivity, right? The ways in which like there has to be an articulation. It's not like what I want to, and you're really anti-mango poem as much as I am, which for those who are not tapped into the joke, mango poems.
Reductive diaspora art is like anathema to me, as Suneil knows.
So like there's the whole like joke about like diasporic artists that like are like the sweet mango on my grandmother's porch that I remember as I was growing up in conditions of the heat, and it's just like okay, we fucking get it.
It's like uncritical nostalgia.
Uncritical nostalgia, especially in the case of South Asia, and in particular India, there's like a slow genocide of Muslims. There's like ethno-fascist regimes of just unbridled capital feudal systems, and so. I think that criticality is central just as much as it is to this question of like a decolonial technology. It's like, well, I mean, what are we talking about? Like, where does the sort of decolonial thinking even begin? What are the kind of conditions under which someone might learn that, And so to go back to this question about, I guess these diasporic kind of articulations, it's not just about loss. Right? It's not just about like, oh, I've been separated from my homeland. How tragic, And it's like, yes, that is a huge part of it. But as Stuart Hall says in the very beginning of the trilogy of this film, it's like, it's not like, yes, diaspora is a void, right? It is a void, but it's not a void that is like, has an irreconcilability to it. It's not a void that can't be necessarily like. Filled, but there's so much possibility in that void. And so as opposed to it being like this tragic sense of loss and displacement, which it definitely is, especially in terms of like climate displacement, in terms of refugees, in terms of the genocide in Gaza, or in Congo or Sudan, like 9 million people in Sudan who were displaced, right? So like it's not, yes, that is a very violent, tragic phenomenon, right? But there's also so much possibility in the question of a migratory image, a migratory cinema, right? Whereas when these images of students being beaten at Jamia Millia Islamia University in India reached me in 2019, all the way across the world, that was the moment that like sparked my entire practice, because I was seeing these images, these violent images, as I was simultaneously trying to grapple with, like my family's anti-colonial past. And that tension of the past and the present, of trying to understand, like, my family were freedom fighters against the Portuguese for generations. They used poetry, right, to raise this kind of national consciousness, my grandmother's family, right? So when I think about that, but then I think about the ethno-nationalist violence that is foundational, yes, to the Indian state, but has been heightened increasingly since 1992, really, Ayodhya, but you could go much further. Anyway, that conflict, I think, is actually the productive void, the productive diasporic underpinning, which is that you are forced to confront all of the past, all of the struggles of your ancestors, and in so many instances, the very present violence that is enacted on a daily basis in that same homeland.
So I just, something that came to mind as you were talking is a food critic once told me a quote, and I cannot remember who the quote is by. It's by a Chinese writer. But the quote goes something like, "What is patriotism but the memory of your favorite childhood food?" And I think about that a lot because what the quote gestures at is how, like, political affiliations are actually have often their root in very primal sensory impulses and associations. And so what I find like your films do is try to reverse engineer that, in the sense, like, fill us with longing, with yearning, this sorts of like unplaceable yearning that can often get co-opted into structures like nationalism. But like, what are we actually missing? Like, what am I missing when I'm homesick? Am I missing like this construct called India? Or am I missing something much more primal, like the things we grow up with, the things that kind of seep into us as evidence of like something that is our own? And so just what you were talking about, like this diaspora as a void, but also the role that the senses, the ineffable plays in that, and like how your films, I think, try to redirect that sense of longing that comes up. But Greg, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say something. Thank you for that comment. And I would definitely love to stay with food, because I love this idea of the sweet mango film. That's a wonderful genre. We're going to have to come back to that. But this sort of sweet mango, this sort of lust or desire that's performed, and who is it performed for, and who's sort of consuming that desire? You mentioned it before. We got to decolonize our own minds, and that's already sort of a struggle on multiple fronts. But yeah, I'm often wondering who are those films being performed for? I mean, we know the answer to the question, where these films are produced and where they're playing. I would love for the sweet mango films to actually go home and see what the people that sort of farm the sweet mangoes would think about it. Well, no, that mango's not really that sweet. And then you remembered it wrong, or maybe you never knew it at all. Maybe you never knew it at all. So what I want to ask you, Suneil, is I love your work. I think you're an outstanding filmmaker and artist. I know how it feels to sort of exist in the margins and the spaces and displacement and feeling at home but not at home. That's the story of my life in North America and in Europe. So what I'm wondering is, for a filmmaker like you that's got these strong ties to your roots in Goa, but being born and raised in Dallas, and sort of living and working primarily in North America, I think you're in New York. What would it feel like? So this sort of, what I'm sort of dreaming of in terms of sort of a decolonial practice and world is just the ability, oh God, I shouldn't even say this, but just the ability to move more, to make it, to be easier to move more, because what I'm wondering is, and this is not at all meant to be a leading or critical question, but what is your imagination of how your films would play in your homeland that you've never visited?
Yeah.
Or is that even a wish for you at all? Is that an audience that you would like to speak to or not, and why?
Well, so maybe we should play the second clip in that case, because I very quickly after I made the first film, I was like, enough of this bullshit, like I need to go to India, you know? And so I bought myself a ticket, you know, and like I made these films with like no funding, you know, like I made my first 3 films with absolutely no funding. I worked as many jobs as I could to make the films, you know. So, so all of these films were like truly like I made them for myself. And we can also talk about with the second film, Letter from Your Far Off Country. that's how I met Devika and so many other close Daisy friends of mine. We've done organizing together. We've spoken at length. We are a huge support network for each other and share a very particular anti-fascist politic that is very, that is the calling of like why I make these works. Now, to go back to your point, the work has screened in Goa, and the reception has been unbelievably moving. They, and many, of course, there's probably plenty of critique that I have not heard, and I am very open to critique, especially from, Dalit filmmakers, et cetera. But it has screened in Goa, and there's a very particular sensibility to it. They're like, especially that last film, Golden Jubilee, which has a folklore kind of element to it, and they're like, we cannot believe that this film has traveled around the world. Like, they're like, we can't believe that story, that folktale that we grew up with is like all like playing at all these, they're like, this is insane. And beyond that, I make an effort, so like this new, that last film was in Konkani, mostly. My father's speaking his native language of Konkani, which he unfortunately did not pass down to me because it's not spoken outside of Goa. It's like, it was a language that was banned from like the 1600s onward, and it wasn't practiced. I mean, it was practiced clandestinely and discreetly. And so my family kept that language alive, as did many Goan families, for generations, for hundreds of generations. Our family was keeping this language alive, and it died with my, and it's really hard to learn. It's really hard to learn. Like, it's not a dialect it's a dialect of a more popular language called Marathi. But anyway, so I have people who come up to me anytime they see these films, and they're like, I cannot believe I'm hearing Konkani on screen. I have so many people who are like, you've unlocked these memories of hearing my grandmother's language, and it's sparked them to like figure out like their relationship to Goa. So this relationship between like migration is so much tied to, it's not just food and scent and memory, but it's also like language is so essential. And so then my new film, Two Refusals, is all in Konkani. And it's just like one of these languages that it's just like there's not a Duolingo option. And in fact, in most festivals, they don't list it as an option, so I can't even say the film's in Konkani because it's not on the drop-down list. You know what I'm saying? So like, but that there's an intention behind that. And I think to go to your point, just to wrap up my thing about, once again, like diasporic longing and all these things is also a desire to make this work, and I mentioned this, is to connect with like-minded people, right? Because I think there was a separation, growing up, in Texas with a lot of internalized white supremacy. Like I wasn't taught to love my people. I wasn't taught to love myself. And it was not coming from many other sources. It was through cinema that I started to like love myself, like truly, like seeing images, from the past, to understand that there was an entire movement of cinema in India, and when I kind of like finally like started
finding your lineage.
The lineage, yeah, and I think you had asked me this at a question during Prismatic Ground very early on. You're like, who do you see yourself in conversation with filmmakers? And I'm like, yeah, like honestly, like Ritwik Ghatak, Mrinal Sen, Guru Dutt. Like, even though I don't make narrative work, I make experimental work, I'm like, that is what taught me that it was possible to even be a filmmaker. But so I make films so I can connect with more people. I make films so I can have these conversations and grow these relationships and grow the community that is just it's not a granted. I'm not just like, oh, cool, here's the like anti-fascist, South Asian group that's like obsessed with experimental cinema. It's like, no, you have to make that community. That community's not just gonna, we don't have a sidebar for anti-fascist daisies at Locarno, you know what I mean?
Please raise your hands just for a few minutes and then we'll get out of the rain. And Greg, Suneil, feel free to jump in also when you are moved, Quaker style.
Or just like any general thoughts, right, on the many things that we've discussed.
We can't feel the rain,
We're so privileged.
We can be in the rain with them.
Should we be in the rain with them? I can do rain. I can do
Speak
rain.
for yourselves. I will remain here.
It feels nice. It's like not really. Yeah,
It's no rain. It's no rain.
Oh,
Can
there's a hand up there. Yeah.
Can you
Greg, did you want to jump in after that? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for that presentation and beautiful work. I would love to know where I can see the full pieces.
I can send you links.
Piracy.
Or you can,
Yeah. My name is Dogozo Mlaba from South Africa. And I really, really enjoyed the conversation. I thought it was conducive and different from what we're used to. Mine is more a comment than it is a question, because you did ask what world do we see, and I think so the work that I do, I run a creative nonprofit where we use art to foster positive change in society, and so I kind of think that the move into a world where cinema is like this almost equality through cinema, I think it's something that begs every artist to kind of engage and be involved in initiatives that do promote, I guess, that equality, you know? Because I think we exist in these spaces and we talk about these things, and then everybody goes back to work and it's business as usual. I think it's incumbent upon each and every one of us as individuals to kind of take it upon ourselves, like he did, and said, no, look, I'm gonna take a plane ticket to India, and imagine if every one of us in this space did those kinds of things. And I mean, some of us obviously don't have money to buy a ticket to India, but like within your own capacity, what is it that you can do in your community to kind of foster that change in your own space? And if all of us do that in our little pockets, then it obviously, it builds up and it builds up and it builds up, and I feel like we can create that global community where literally, if I'm in South Africa and you're in Dallas and somebody else is in Italy, like we forming that communication, that community of what are you doing? Oh, I'm doing this. I can support in this way. I can support in that way. And I think we exist in that space that is possible. And yeah, that's the kind of world that I see, that we're really contributing to the upliftment of society in the spaces that we exist through the arts. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. So, yeah, we have another comment, so I'll let her jump in.
Mine was a question. I don't know if you want to like respond to the comment first, but if not, I think for me, my question would be, earlier you spoke about, someone said, how do you speak about a place that you miss, that you've never been to, right? And maybe to put it in another way, one thing I was thinking of is, how do you tell stories of places that you've never been in? One thing about this kind of storytelling is there are generations before you that will watch these films and say, that's not your story to tell, you weren't there, you don't know, etc., etc. Have you received any backlash in that sense? And what are your thoughts to that standpoint, to say these stories should be told by specific people because they knew it better? And then maybe just to add on, how do you ensure that you do the relevant homework? How do you make sure that you have all the knowledge? Because the big risk here is getting something factual wrong and missing someone's viewpoint or being biased in a certain way, and then somebody could say that you have completely basically haven't done justice to what the reality was at that time. So the two parts is, number one, how do you respond to people who say, this is not your story to tell because you weren't there and you wouldn't know the facts. And then also for you making sure that you completely understand the story and the facts and you have it all together so that you can, adequately tell the story.
Should we keep taking comments, or should I maybe respond to that one? Yeah, I mean, I love both of these comments, and I have a lot of, I really appreciate what you were saying about like people working in these spaces, you know, kind of locally and things like that. Devika works with an abolitionist organization called Crown Heights Care Collective. Shout out Crown Heights Care Collective, does amazing abolitionist work. And you know, I do organizing as well in various capacities. But you know, that's kind of just, we are desperately trying and also trying to be artists and cultural workers, but we know that like, you know, cultural work's not gonna get us free alone, right? Like film's not gonna get us free alone. But it does play a role. So anyway, I'll say that. But to your very important questions, yeah, it's something I think about a lot. I think the work that we've seen so far, right? These are films that are really coming from a personal place. So they're coming from my own mode of expression, right? Like it's not, I'm very weary of, once again, going back to this idea of extraction, right? It's central to these questions of who gets to tell these stories, right? Like this idea of kind of, you know, parachuting in somewhere, even if you have lineage to these histories or to these geographies, right? This kind of like parachuting in and extracting a story from a certain culture that you might have a connection to, but maybe did not grow up in, such as myself, right? So this is the difficult part with not having seen the full films, right? You get like a few minute clip extract, which I was very weary of, because there's a lot in these films that the audience, if you haven't seen these films, won't understand, or not won't understand, won't get the full context of. So these works are very personal. They're like personal expressions of my own feelings, of questions of diaspora, anti-colonialism, you know, nationalism, technology, images, you know.
And also, can I just, sorry to interrupt, but also, you know, you make these films also, if you see the whole film and understand Suneil's practice, it's a way of building solidarity with a world that is not fully his, which is, I think, one of the things that is so great about cinema. So there's a way of making films about worlds that are not your own, that are extractive, and there are ways of making films about worlds that are not your own, that is like reaching out a hand, you know, say, join me. And that, you know, the way the films are framed, they really, I mean, this is like building solidarities between India, the US, Angola. I mean, it's like finding the ways in which we're all connected, not by any sort of bland universalist things, but really by like histories of resistance and struggle. So that's also a very important dimension of the work that maybe relates to the question that you're asking.
Yeah, thank you. Like, yeah, thank you for that. But I would also say that like there has been criticism of the work, and I take that criticism with like gratitude, you know, like especially when it's coming, for instance, from Dalit artists or filmmakers who are like, you know, I'm not Dalit, right? For those of you who don't know, Dalit is like the term that we use, Dalit Bahujan is the term we used for what was called like, you know, lower caste or, you know,
untouchable.
Untouchables, yeah, the kind of caste system, right? So untouchables, right? So we don't call them untouchables, we call them Dalit Bahujans, but it's also a way of like, you know, caste was supposedly abolished, but the caste system is very much in full effect with daily lynchings happening across the country of Dalit people who are not allowed to even have the image of Ambedkar, who was you know, he was the first caste abolitionist. He wrote a book called The Annihilation of Caste. He was a sort of, anyway, a very important figure. He helped write the Constitution of India, right? So he was the founder. Are we wrapping up? Yeah. Anyway, but this really essential question is like, you know, who are we responsible to, right? Who are we beholden to? It's a question I ask myself all the time, and it's a question I ask my students all the time. Who are you beholden to?
And also this question of like, this is not your world. There's a question of ownership and belonging, which is also like, I won't get into that now because Kevin has given us many wrap-up signs. But yeah, I think it's a question really worth thinking through in the realm of cultural ownership and belonging, how they can be different things, and how building new alliances can also sometimes mean opening up your worlds in ways that invite like intrusion and exploitation. It's difficult to draw those boundaries. We have to wrap up. Greg, I feel like you wanted to say something earlier and you got cut off, so would you close us out with a comment?
I don't know if I want to close us, but I'll just add quickly just to say I so much appreciate this idea of you saying you make films to sort of find your community. There's a film artist that I work with. She's a radical animator. Her name is Kelly Gallagher. She does outstanding work.
Love Kelly.
You love Kelly. Everybody loves Kelly.
Shout out Kelly.
More people need to know Kelly and love her. But one of the things that I always appreciate that she says is again, just this idea of, she makes, who is her audience when she's asked this question at festivals? Who is she speaking to? Who is she beholden to? Whatever. And yeah, her response is, well, I make films to find my community, to sort of encounter my community. And I think that's also beautiful. Maybe it's not an ending statement, but just the idea of finding community, this idea of world building, and just, trying to conjure this world that we want to live in step by step.
Beautiful note to end on. We can continue this conversation, off the stage. Thank you, everyone, for staying this whole time.
Thank you so much.
The humidity,
Kevin.
the rain. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Suneil. Thank you, Greg. This was absolutely wonderful.